Good evening from Los Angeles. I'm Anjali Sharon, Acting Executive Director of Asia Society, Southern California. On behalf of ASSC, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program, Supply Chain Disruption, the Impact on Los Angeles and Singapore. This program is the fifth installment of our U.S. Asia Real Estate Initiative, a comprehensive multi-year initiative to promote a deeper understanding of real estate issues that are of shared importance to Southern California and urban areas in Asian countries. USAREI is generously made possible by founding sponsor OUE and in collaboration with the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate and the USC Jaime Center for Real Estate. We are fortunate to have with us today Professor Richard Green, Director of the USC Lusk Center, to moderate this session. It is my privilege now to turn it over to Richard to introduce the panelists and begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anjali, and it's a pleasure to be with you. As Anjali said, my name is Richard Green. I'm Director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate and a professor in the Price School of Public Policy, Marshall School of Business, and Department of Economics. And it will be my great pleasure this evening to moderate an all-star panel on an issue that nobody cared about 5 months ago, which was the supply chain. And the reason I say nobody cared about it is because if you look at Google search, Google Trends, nobody was looking up the phrase as recently as last summer. And then suddenly an enormous spike in interest in the topic. There's an argument about when the phrase even started. Some put it back to the mid 80s, some put it back to late 70s. But whenever the phrase came into being, it certainly is something that people are worried about right now because it's having such an influence on so much that's happening in the economy. Our panel tonight is, as usual for this group, an international panel. We are privileged to have with us Kenneth Lim. Kenneth is the Assistant Chief Executive for Industry at the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. He has a remarkable background in technology. He was the Chief Technology Officer of the port before he became the Assistant Chief Executive Officer. And as one might expect, he has a degree in computer science from the National University of Singapore, given what else we've said about him. We also have with us tonight Jaime Lee. First thing I want to say about Jaime is we're privileged to have her as a member of the Lusk board. Jaime, thank you for that. But her day job is as Chief Executive Officer at Jameson Realty here in Los Angeles, which has done a remarkable job of redevelopment around the city and in particular in Koreatown. But for this evening, what we are really focusing on with Jaime is the fact that she's the board president and commissioner of the Port of Los Angeles. Jaime has a law degree and an English degree, magna cum laude from USC. So Jaime, thanks so much for being here with us. And last but not least, we have Kevin Klowden. Kevin is the executive director for the Center for Regional Economics and managing economist at the Milken Institute. He has been in that role for a good long time, more than 18 years. He's also chair of the Trade Finance Advisory Council for the U.S. Department of Commerce, in which role he in both his roles, he needs to think about supply chain, ports, transportation, et cetera. So as you can see, we have a really great panel assembled for you tonight. So we're going to begin with our guest from overseas. Mr. Lim, could you talk to us a little bit just about what's going on in Singapore right now with respect to the port and the way you are seeing the sort of clogging up the supply chain that we are seeing worldwide, and what do you think the causes of that bottleneck might be?
Thank you. Maybe I'll set the stage to say that some research shows that the global vessel schedule reliability has fallen, right? I mean, from 2018 to 2020, the average vessel schedule reliability is about 75%. But now this year, I think it has dropped to 35 to 40%, with an average delay of close to 7.5 days for late vessel arrival. So that's kind of like the context for the global scene. At Singapore, I think we first have to understand that Singapore is a transshipment hub. So the transshipment hub, our import-export, local import-export accounts maybe to about 20% of the volume. And we do about like 36.7 million TEUs last year in 2020. So with that amount, the transshipment hub allows multiple connection of vessels to Singapore and then offload it, and then other vessels will bring across. So far it's manageable. I think this year we have seen a few disruption from starting in March, Suez blockage, right? And then the Suez Canal resulted in a delay, and 20% of those volume are destined for Singapore. Then in May, we saw Yantian port also had some congestion. They are closed on 21st May, lasted for about 34 days. Again, the backlog will come into Singapore. Likewise, in August and October, we also have seen. And so far, Singapore therefore played the role of a catch-up port. A catch-up port being for allowing the shipping lines to come to Singapore, quickly offload, and then catch up in their schedule for the next port. And in so doing, maybe later on we can discuss about it. We add on the resources, add on the berths, add on yard cranes, yard space, as well as resources. Singapore port is already 24/7 since its operation. So maybe I'll pause here and just let the other panels speak. Thanks.
I sometimes need to remember to unmute myself even after all this time. Thank you very much for that overview about what's going on in Singapore. And I just want to let the audience know, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at any time. Jaime, let's talk about what's going on in LA, and in particular with respect to what we heard from Kenneth about Singapore operating 24/7. I know you've made some comments to me about the feasibility of that in the Los Angeles context. And so maybe when you're talking about what's going on here, you could mention that, but just more broadly, how fast is stuff getting through LA?
Sure. Well, we are seeing obviously a slower schedule of boxes coming through, but what we are finding is that the vast majority of boxes that do need to get through get offloaded from a vessel and through the terminal and out the gate within about 3 to 4 days. Overall, to set the context, we are just seeing a tsunami of imports. And a lot of it was, as factories closed in 2020 in Asia that supply most of the import goods here to the US because of COVID outbreaks before the pandemic really hit the United States. We saw a big lag there. And then as everyone shut down and stayed home and people were no longer shopping, they were afraid to spend money. They certainly weren't spending their money on services. So that's where the savings started to accumulate. But we saw this drop in orders. And so retailers were really putting off a lot of the orders that they may otherwise have. And then certainly, as we all know and have seen, that as the economy has recovered, as people were investing those dollars, mostly in public equities throughout the pandemic, and then still certainly we're not spending those dollars on services like going out to restaurants, traveling, airfare, hotels, vacations, but rather sitting at home, clicking. The luxury retail numbers from 2020 were some of the best ever among the super luxury brands. And a lot of that was the buying power in Asia as well. But now that we are seeing the services numbers coming back, we still somehow are not seeing any sort of abatement in the goods purchasing online. So everyone's sitting at home through 2020, they're working from home, they're nitpicking their home office space. First, it was that mad rush. You can buy a webcam or these ring lights or iPads or computers and printers and all the peripherals that you needed at home. Then it turned to people were buying furniture like crazy, and they still are buying furniture like crazy. I am absolutely guilty. I've ordered some things in May that still haven't arrived yet. And so everyone's redoing a deck project. They're building a gazebo or a pergola. They're redoing all of their outdoor furniture. Many people are building pools. If you want to rent a house with a pool in Los Angeles, it's nearly impossible. The competition is so stiff. And so that has created this additional surge of import demand. And then now on top of that, as people, as you said, throughout 2021 have been searching for supply chain and concerned about supply chain issues. Now large retailers are forward ordering even more, as opposed to the just-in-time schedule that they had always had. Now they put in earlier all of the holiday supplies. Many of these, small brick and mortar retailers, the toy stores and things like that, the companies that their entire, annual income depends on their holiday ordering, they put those orders in farther in advance to try to predict what they were going to sell, to make sure that their shelves would be stocked by the time the holidays have come in. So that has actually exacerbated the issue. Whereas we had thought towards the end of the summer peak, we would have had some catch up time before the holiday orders really started coming in. Instead, all of those forward orders and catch up have actually sort of clogged up even more. The bigger issue, though, is because you see these headlines and people love to first look out at the San Pedro Bay and count the vessels at anchor out there. And then the headlines, whatever will fit in a 10, 12-word sentence, breakdown in the supply chain, chaos at the ports, all of these sorts of things. We certainly don't have a breakdown in the supply chain. We have absolute stress on all of the nodes along the entire supply chain. We have a system that was built for a certain amount of capacity, and now we've added 20% additional container volume and imports onto that capacity. And that's what we're really seeing. It's that lack of resiliency and the ability to flex with the volume that's coming in. However, we're still moving a historic number of boxes. Our throughput from what the port is processing from taking boxes off of vessels is, all-time highs. We would consider ourselves one of the most efficient ports in the entire world right now. But the problem is you can't unload a box if there's nowhere to set it down on the terminal. So the tarmacs are totally full. We generally consider terminals to be at full capacity at about 70 to 80% of terminal lands being covered in boxes. And we're at about 100% now. And so you can imagine how tight it is for even trucks to come through and maneuver around in those spaces with the terminal lands being so full. On top of that, we would say we have a chassis shortage. You have to have a roadable chassis or a free chassis, not one with a box sitting on it on some yard somewhere, in order to come pick up a box. And we have a different system here where we have individual private companies that own all of the chassis as opposed to the ports or terminals themselves owning the chassis, as I know they do in Asia. We could use more truck drivers. And there have been numbers out there that say there's probably a shortage of about 30,000 truck drivers nationwide. And we really need to work harder to make this an enticing job. So many people that have a commercial driver's license have shifted over towards different types of modes of transportation. Take, for instance, a UPS driver, an Amazon delivery driver, certainly a safer and potentially better paying job than loading containers and sitting to drive, to the Inland Empire multiple times per day. And then ultimately the biggest issue here, and we're trying to avoid the finger pointing game because everyone's trying to finger point, but I'm just trying to highlight all along the supply chain, we've got 2 billion square feet of industrial warehouse space in California. It's the largest interconnected, warehouse supply chain in the entire country. That is over 100% full as well. All of the distribution centers are full. All of the big box retailer stores are full. Everybody's just completely at capacity. There's nowhere to put this stuff. And we are unfortunately seeing a tragedy of containers being strewn all over neighborhoods throughout the Southland, whether it's in the local communities surrounding the port, boxes on chassis sitting on the side of the road, or decked chassis or decked boxes, sitting under freeway underpasses, sitting out in random lots all over the place throughout Southern California. And so this is stress at every single node everywhere. And that's where we find ourselves. We don't really see an abatement of this in the foreseeable future, probably for the next 12 months.
Yeah,
Oh, you said 24/7 also. So
yeah, please.
the Biden administration did come in and make a big show of 24/7 operations. The gates are open. Anyone is welcome to come pick up a box and make an appointment time. Nobody is coming. So BCOs do need to hire people to come pick up the boxes. The gates are open. I know that other people were saying whatever neighborhood issues there may be, et cetera, but the port is certainly open. We welcome people to come during the hoot shift. But from what I hear, there are a few takers in that window.
I just want to amplify a couple of your points. One of the things that happened through the pandemic is, GDP has recovered much faster than many people thought it would. but personal income is still well above trend from before the pandemic, and service spending is still not quite back to trend. And so you put that together, people are still saving a lot of money. So there is still a lot of runway for people to buy stuff. And so that's not alleviated. And then when you talk about space, I heard Hamid Moghadam, who is the CEO of Prologis, speak a few weeks ago. And he said Prologis, who owns more industrial real estate than anybody else in the country, has nothing available for rent right now, zero. And so, yeah, there's no place for this stuff to go. And I think that's a good segue for our panelist, who's going to sort of talk about how everything interconnects with each other, Kevin Klowden. So Kevin, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Richard. And so there's a lot of connections going on, and a lot of the connections aren't recent. This is something that has quite honestly been building for a number of years. We've been seeing for a couple decades the massive push towards just in time, the massive ability in a computerized world where we can track packages, we can track containers, where we can have relative predictability of ships, that the system was set up so that we could have supply chains that run all over the world. We have operations that go all over the place, and it's benefited people because it's allowed us to make goods anywhere in the world. It's allowed us to have components that get assembled from all over the world. It's lowered costs in a lot of different ways for companies. But what it's also done is it's left us more vulnerable. And we hadn't yet faced a level of disruption to this magnitude, but there were incidents in the past. The flooding in Bangkok, Thailand, that disrupted the hard drive industry, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan, that massively disrupted a number of operations there. I mean, even before that, the Kobe earthquake a couple decades before that, where we saw elements of the supply chain get nailed. They got disrupted, there were problems, and we saw backups that came out of it, but they only affected certain industries. They might infect computers, they might have affected automobiles. Now what we saw is a massive ripple effect that went through, not only because of the fact that ordering was disrupted, because production was disrupted, but because where people needed the supplies and when they needed them completely violated a lot of the predictable operations that companies have been operating under, that ports have been operating under, that shipping companies have been operating under, but especially manufacturers. We first saw it early in the pandemic when personal protective equipment was not available, when people had not stockpiled, when the equipment that was coming in was not necessarily being directed to the places where it was needed. I actually spent the first few months of the pandemic in particular tied up with that issue and helping to facilitate some of these goods going to the places they were supposed to. We saw in particular, on a daily basis, issues like toilet paper and paper towels. And the issue wasn't that they weren't being made enough. The problem was at the time is that they were being made and they were being sent to the wrong places, or they were being made of the wrong kind. So we didn't, you had a lot of restaurant supplies for toilet paper, for food, for milk, for otherwise, that went astray. There was a massive problem where tons of gallons of milk in the United States wound up spoiling because it was all directed to school lunches and the schools closed and they couldn't redirect it. There wasn't a position to do that. So we saw this disruption happening. But then as Jaime and Kenneth have both mentioned about playing catch up in the way that the ports have been put front and center in playing catch up, it's a huge issue. But even beyond that, even beyond those, the fact that a lot of the predictions on where goods were supposed to go are now different. We've got a lot of online ordering, a lot of people buying from other sources, people investing, as noted, heavily in construction, home construction, and other ways that nobody was set to do. And we had a few other things that sort of added to that. People may forget, but we had a whole series of tariffs that were put in the United States for competitive reasons in the last administration on lumber, on aluminum, on steel, that not only served to lead to a number of companies to delay purchases, but also to shift manufacturing outside the United States, in many cases because the cost of doing so, ironically, because of the tariffs on the raw materials, meant that they would then put the goods elsewhere. This meant that when the demand in the US suddenly spiked, that none of the supply chains were ready for it. There was no buildup. There was not enough storage of materials. It's a huge problem. We also saw leading up
So
to
Kevin,
this.
can I
Yeah,
just ask, because this is so interesting. I just want to clarify something.
yeah.
So if the lumber has a tariff on it, so you manufacture something using lumber outside the United States, that thing that's manufactured does not have the embedded tariff on it. Is that, did I get that right?
The tariff is on the raw good. There is still going to be, let's say if you made it in China, there might be a punitive tariff depending on the product, but you do the math and you discover that it's cheaper, even with a potential tariff making in China, or let's say you make it in Vietnam, where that tariff isn't the same. There might not be the same level of free trade agreement or anything else that in some other places, but it's still the World Trade Organization setup. You decide it's cheaper to make it there. It's cheaper to make it in the Philippines. It's cheaper to make it in Mexico. It's cheaper to make it. So, but most of the time it's in the Pacific Rim because the raw materials costs are so much lower that you're willing to accept whatever other duties there are, because the end result is that it's a cheaper process for you. And that kind of decision making, which has been made over the last few years, even as some manufacturing in the US has picked up and actually recovered and done pretty well, but a lot of these bulk manufacturing items, especially when it comes to things like furniture, especially when it comes to delaying construction because of raw materials costs, that catches up in an environment like this. And then the other thing, just to note, and I'll be done, is we also saw leading up to the pandemic, actually the previous few years, a major shift where the shipping companies, particularly the ocean-going shipping companies, wound up with massive extra amounts of capacity. They had invested in cargo ships and kept a lot of older cargo ships going. And there was a number of different large shipping lines, and based on an expectation of an increase in traffic, the irony was that increase in traffic they were expecting that we have now hadn't materialized a few years ago. And so you saw a number of the shipping companies take ships out of service, either to go send them to be broken up or sell them off or otherwise. And you saw mergers in some of the shipping lines because they were, ironically at the time, at risk of bankruptcy. They'd invested so heavily in this extra capacity and they faced all these competitive pressures. That's all gone now. And in fact, you're seeing a lot of smaller companies that I'm sure that Kenneth and Jaime can talk about racing to fill the void. And that just makes things even more uncertain.
So I want to come back to this issue of capacity, but I think a good way to do this, and this is actually also relates to a question from Thomas, and if I mispronounce your name, I'm sorry, Malayal in the audience, is Singapore is making a big deal out of the fact that it will be the world's first digital port. And so the first thing, Kenneth, you could just tell us what exactly does that mean? And then I want to follow up on that question.
Sure. When we talk about the physical port and, in Tuas, we are going to consolidate our capacity, right? As I mentioned, we do about like 37 million TEUs in last year. For the Tuas port that we are building up, that decision was made maybe like a decade ago to up the capacity to 65 million TEUs, right? So, and as you know, Singapore is a very small country. We have limited land, and therefore, what we need to do is, besides building up the port infrastructure, is to make it very, very digital. And this driver for digitalizing the port is also coming from the resource, because we don't have enough resources and all that. And as Jaime mentioned, you got prime mover drivers, you got the yard crane operators, key crane operators, all the horizontal transport operators. how do you get that labor force, right? So because of the shortage of resources, the port needs to be very highly automated and digitally connected, right? So what we do, for instance, in the port clearance, we have launched Digital Port at SG, which is to make it into a one-stop shop portal for port clearance, so that you can clear MPA, immigration, the environment agencies, and other 16 forms to be filled up all digitally in one platform. So I think that itself will increase the digital savviness of the port, reduce business costs, and improve efficiency. Beyond that, actually, we feel and advocate that beyond Singapore, the ships that call on different ports actually should also have these digital capabilities. And therefore, we kind of advocate a digital ocean, and it really is about, as a technology jargon of API, which is a system-to-system linkage. So without user going to a portal to key in, the ship itself or the ship agent could actually send it through their system to different port clearance. And we have actually Get Trade Lands, we have Port Rotterdam, PSA, Calista, them to kind of adopt a common data standards and API, so that we can move from many stops, many clicks, to one stop, many clicks, to one stop, zero click eventually. So that's how we kind of drive digitalization. So that's in the port area. And on the supply chain side, electronic bill of lading is something that we push, so that people don't have to go to the port to surrender bill of lading, paper bill of lading to retrieve the cargoes and all that, as well as digital initiatives on bunkering. So Singapore being a bunkering hub also, we do at one time you pick about 15 million metric tons of bunker per year. So we need to also digitalize this part as well. So, and just now, as before the session, we talk about startup communities building up and all that, is to build up this vibrancy in the ecosystem, so that the maritime transport infrastructure, ships, and the shore jobs can all be digitalized and automated as well.
There you go.
I did it again. So Jaime, and again, we have a good set of questions in chat, but we could certainly take a couple more. So if you have a question for our panel, please feel free, and I'll start getting to the questions from the audience soon. But this whole idea of taking what you have and making it more efficient. Now, Singapore is doing more than that, because they're moving their whole port beyond creating this new electronic infrastructure. But how much do you think LA could just take what it already has and get more out of it? And how much do you think there just needs to be an expansion of capacity, given the future demands on the cargo network worldwide?
Right. So there's a few different prongs in it, and we have developed over the last few years our own GE Port Optimizer to digitalize all of the port operations, to give a thorough line of sight from people to be able to see, when is their box going to arrive here at the port, where it is in the terminal, to be able to set up the truck appointments, or whether it's going to rail, et cetera. We're trying to push for adoption within the linkages through the supply chain here in the United States. And certainly we're seeing more interconnectivity as well between us and other ports where we normally would not have. But all of a sudden we're receiving empty containers from the Gulf Coast ports, which we don't want. But in many respects, from the shipping lines, that's the fastest way to get empty containers back to Asia. And so somehow we're receiving many, many more empties than have come into our port, which is quite unusual as well. So there are a lot of different ways that we can flex. We want to be able to create, peel off yards where we can store these chassis, whether they are empties or other laden containers that need to be picked up by other people. So we need to be able to have flexible spaces that can lead us to that resiliency in the future. So not only, this digital line of sight, but also the ability to flex our capacity. As far as our own terminal backlands and crane operating capacity and heights and all of that stuff, we have continued to invest in all of that infrastructure. We certainly can accommodate more capacity at the Port of Los Angeles. And by all of our predictive measures, over the next 20 years, we're supposed to be at about 40 million TEUs. And I specifically remember being in Hamburg port in 2019, talking about one day we're going to hit 10 million. We can't wait to hit 10 million. We had been about that 9.2, 9.3, 9.5 million TEUs. That's just for the Port of Los Angeles alone, not including Long Beach across the bay, where together we are one of the top 10 port complexes in the world. But for us, that had always been a marker. And suddenly in the pandemic, where early on in 2020, our volumes had dropped 25, 30% overnight. Then suddenly within that year, we had hit this 10.2 magic number. And once again, it's we have that capacity, but the entire system is not resilient enough to flex with this very sudden 20% increase in cargo volumes that have come in. So we need to put in all of those measures. We also need people to come pick up their stuff so that we can continue to move boxes in the way that we do.
So one of the things that makes LA very different from Singapore is, as Kenneth told us, Singapore is principally a transshipment port, whereas LA, it is a port where stuff comes in and then gets distributed to the country, or comes in from the country, empties as a lot of it, and distributed out. Do you think the rail and road networks need substantial upgrading for LA's port capacity to increase, or do you think they're kind of where they need to be?
It can certainly be increased. I think other destinations as well are things that we have talked about. About a third of our cargo inbound goes out by rail, but a third of it stays here. And so when you look at population growth projections, a lot of that growth is here in Southern California. The consumers are here in Southern California. So it doesn't really help to put a box on a train car if it's going to go to Chicago, for instance. So to the extent that additional capacity and growth of volume goes out to these other areas that are serviced by our two railroads, then certainly that would be great. I did watch that 60 Minutes special that came out a couple of weeks ago that was just basically saying Chicago and the rail yard is full. And so, yes, to the extent that we have shorter routes that can go out by rail from on-dock rail yards here at the port to, for instance, closer locations like Salt Lake City or other distribution points within the country, that would be certainly something that we're looking at hard.
So Kevin, I want to ask you the big picture question, which is about, again, kind of resiliency and the fact that a just-in-time world is a fragile world. It means that if anything goes wrong, everything goes wrong. And one of the Deutsche Bank put out a statistic that I really loved just before the pandemic, as a matter of fact, that showed that, well, Chinese parts made up a fairly small share of stuff that's consumed in the United States. The share of things consumed in the United States that had a Chinese part was very large. So it was, and it's been too long, but it's like 15% of stuff was Chinese, but 70% of stuff had a Chinese part, which meant that if one Chinese, if China goes away, that's 70% of stuff where you're scrambling and trying to figure out what to do next. So do you see sort of a lesson being learned from this for, more redundancy? And by that, I mean more, not just onshoring, but things like you don't just have a Chinese supplier, you have an Indian supplier, you have a Vietnamese supplier or something like that. And do you see businesses willing to keep a little more inventory than they were before in order to avoid these sort of disruptions in the years to come?
Well, the answer is going to be that you're going to certainly see, and was a push even before the pandemic to regionalize some of the distribution networks. A lot of the pushes are going to be to try and shift some of these secondary suppliers and manufacturers to other locations that are closer. So there had been a push in Asia to try and replace some of the manufacturers in the US or Mexico, Canada, Latin America, or Europe even with somebody a little bit closer. You'll see that redoubled to some degree. You're going to see that in the US, where we're going to look at Mexico. We're going to look at other places that come across as more regionally relevant and available to help us out. And that's a trend that I expect to actually continue, but it takes time. One of the things that really did happen, one of the reasons you see this issue with 70% of products having a Chinese part, is that one of the things that a lot of the Chinese manufacturers, particularly in the Pearl River Delta, did is that they became the dominant suppliers in specialty areas. It just became a matter where both in terms of price and quality and that combination, there really wasn't a better alternative. It's the same game that Japan had actually played before that. We've seen in certain areas, sometimes Korea's played it. We've seen in Taiwan and semiconductors in particular, which is a major issue in terms of the semiconductor supplies. And so we're seeing shifts on that. And so with semiconductors, I'm well aware of the fact that there have been conscious decisions in Europe to facilitate and encourage redundant manufacturing, particularly for cars and other areas in Germany. And it doesn't have to be, and the suppliers don't even have to be in Germany. They could be somewhere in the European Union, and it feels like it's secure and safe. In the US, there's been a significant push and a look by the Biden administration to find alternative sources to avoid disruptions in areas like that. But it takes time. And one of the things that's also important about it is it takes money. We forget that most of these decisions were made not just because of the fact that, the majority of the people of the world live in Asia, but because of the fact that a lot of companies were making decisions based on growth patterns and based on cost. And it was a lot easier for them to go to the specialists. And those specialists could be in Italy, specialists could be in Germany, specialists could be in Brazil. But the problem is that, as you said, if you're not stockpiling enough and you're only dependent on one supplier or one location, you do leave yourself vulnerable. And I think there'll be a real reassessment on that. But I don't expect every company to follow the same solution. I don't expect every industry to follow the same pattern or solution.
Well, one thing do you think Wall Street analysts will get it? So you're covering it, and the problem is most of these guys are like 29 years old. You're covering a company and you see that they're building up inventories, and as a result of that, you're not using your capital as quote unquote efficiently as you might. Do you see analysts punishing companies for engaging in that kind of behavior?
I think that you'll see analysts being willing to give a certain amount of leeway if there's consistency in results. That if they can see a smoothing out, that there is going to be a certain amount of give. The problem comes if the companies overstockpile, if they build up too much, and then they wind up dumping excess inventory, holding on to parts that become outmoded, that kind of thing, then you're going to see some punishment. And that's why I expect it to play out.
It just occurred to me, a metaphor is the story about why Southwest Airlines has done so. I mean, there are a number of reasons it's done well, but they very early on started buying fuel futures. And as a result of that, managed their fuel cost. And of course, that's an expensive thing. When you're buying hedges, that's not a free thing to do. So maybe, and it seems like analysts reward Southwest pretty well for its behavior. So maybe there's some hope there. Let me turn to the audience.
I think people will revert back to whatever is cheapest and meets their quarterly numbers.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Which is why we're here in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I wish, Jaime, I didn't agree with you, but I hope Kevin is right. But I tend to agree with you. One of the things we've learned is people's memories are incredibly short. We see this over and over again. But you know what? Kevin, I thought, very eloquently stated why analysts should change how they look at things. So let's hope they listen to Kevin. I do want to start going through some audience questions so we can make sure we tend to them. From James Twerdall, the price of a container from China to North America has come down to about $14,000. That's still 4 to 5 times what it was a year ago. Anyone care to forecast what the cost will be after CNY or by the end of this year? And personally, that's an extraordinary number. I didn't know that. Any forecasts about what it's going to cost to send stuff from there to here in the year to come? Nobody wants to take that one on.
I mean, that's just guessing. It's hard to guess. I would say that one thing that those have made so many headlines, especially when it was some of the spot pricing was reaching 25,000. But a lot of that is not, the vast majority of containers that are under contracts, that are put into contracts on a seasonal basis. And that, that accounts for a huge amount of volume. And what you said, like Kevin was pointing out about the other ships and this sort of opportunistic shipping, that we'll see this one-off rogue vessel kind of comes in with a small number of boxes because people are trying to monopolize on this desire. But those vessels also don't get a regular berth spot either. So they tend to sit out there even longer. So, those higher prices don't necessarily lead to faster gains either. But yeah, I'm not going to venture a guess on what the pricing will be.
But you said, so what share of the containers are under contract? So that really is, so what's the average? So this is a marginal cost instead of an average cost, right?
Yeah, it depends, except for then you see like Amazon making big news about, oh, we chartered our own vessel to bring all our boxes by. And then we're passing all those prices on to consumers.
So, one thing I wanted, so automation. So Kenneth, talk a little bit about how Singapore is automated, which is different from digitalization. And Jaime, tell us a little bit about the experience of Los Angeles with automation. So Kenneth?
Oh, okay. I can talk about automation, like the Tuas port and even at the current Panjang port. I think I also saw in some question the question about innovation. And I think that is one big driver for us, given that we are short of resources and land. That really put the impetus on us to innovate, as you rightly point out. And therefore, R&D is a big component, and in Tuas Port, from the way we construct Tuas Port on using Kazon method to build up the Tuas Port, to the way the yard crane operator doing it remotely through automation, the use of sensors and IoTs and video analytics to operate the yard. To autonomous, to the trial of autonomous prime movers, automatic guided vehicles, electrification. These are ongoing, and already some are deployed. Even to the extent of the deconing of the container is actually being R&D now. Using soft robotic arms to feel the different types of cone and then do the unlocking and the twisting of the lock, and also lashing on board the vessels. So I think there is a lot of focus of pulling up from our universities, researchers, startup to really look at automation. And so that the workforce itself in operating the yard could actually now, instead of sitting at the yard crane and middle of the night or the hot sun, they are now being consolidated at the control centers. So one yard crane operator now can operate about 6 yard crane, looking at the different, and only manage the exception. Those are what we feel are important to make the future of work in the port to be more automated and digitalized.
Jaime, comments on automation in Port of LA?
Yeah, people have noted that a lot of, if you just automate everything, then everything would be fine. And that's not necessarily the case. We do have one automated terminal at the Port of LA. It is certainly not our most efficient or productive one by a long shot, but I don't want to be too mean to them. But, and it's certainly not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, given the technology that exists at some of the automated ports in Asia. But, it's something that, as we look to every area along the supply chain, and we look to every area within our lives, whether it's an application on our phone or a piece of machinery or equipment, I think certainly there's a human partnership through every stage of this. These machines can't run or be fixed or operate without that human element, but it's certainly something that the industry is looking hard at.
So I want to follow up on sort of this whole idea of innovation, and we have it's a broader question. So from Ganangad Maney, and I'm sorry again if I'm mispronouncing your name. They say that crisis is the mother of innovation. And what innovations have you observed for companies across the value chain to absorb the increased supply chain costs and rising inflation rates? And let me recast that question just a little bit. So one of the things that economics has taught me is that people are pretty adaptable and they do respond to incentives, not always exactly the way economists would say that they would respond, but nevertheless, they respond. So, we're hearing things, this problem is going to be, and we sort of at the beginning, we're kind of gloomy about people still have money in their pockets. We're not manufacturing enough stuff. There isn't room in warehouses. But the flip side is, I think if you asked us 20 months ago, would we as an economy have been able to respond as well to the pandemic as we have, which required enormous amounts of adjustments on the part of a lot of people, I don't think most people would have thought that we would have done as well as we've actually done. And I actually think, you always want to be careful here because there is nothing good about COVID. It's done really terrible, terrible things, but it did, to me at least, demonstrate the remarkable resiliency of the American economy. And so how are we going to be able to adjust? Is it going to be years before we get past this? Or are we going to figure out faster than that? And I'm going to put you, Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot on this one before I come to our other panelists.
Well, there are two things here. First is the investment side. It takes a while. Some of the things that we need to do where we need to put our capital, you're talking about when you put an order in for new ships, it takes a while. When you put, building a factory, well, that obviously takes a while, depending on the permitting and everything else. That can, some of building a semiconductor factory can take up to a couple of years. So, some of these things, no matter, even if people make the decision to invest right now, it takes a while. When you invest in automation, you also you make significant changes to a port. Well, what happens if the system isn't, if the changes aren't reflected all the way through? You can still have problems. And so, I would expect that a certain amount of the things that people do go ahead with, that they do invest in, that they find a fundamental reason to do, partial reshoring, things like that, that's a couple of years. Some of it could take 5 years. Some of it could take longer. And then you also have that side that, that Jaime and you mentioned, which is the cynical side, is that how many companies, how many others basically decide, what, this disruption wasn't enough. We're going to wait for the next one. And we don't know what the next one's going to be. And if that happens, it could take a while longer. None of it's simple. Even some of the things, that Kenneth is specialized in with Singapore and digitization. Singapore has led the world in many ways in breakthroughs in digitization, digital payments, digitization, placing paperwork. They've helped to be, among other things, champions of something called LEIs, legal entity identifiers, and it would basically a way to try and streamline exports and movement of goods with digital processes instead of just physical paperwork that lots of places still require. All of those are great, but all of them take a bit of time. They take adoption, they take adaptation. I absolutely hope that when we have situations like this where they're pushing innovation, that they stick. But even my most optimistic side says it's going to take a while.
I do think something about Singapore that's worth mentioning here, though, is it doesn't actually take that long to build an industrial building. And the World Bank has loads of international comparative statistics that I love, but one of my favorite is how long does it take to get a building permit to build an industrial building? And then Singapore is the world leader on that. And it's like, and Kenneth, I probably don't have this exactly, but it's like 12 days from the time you bring in your plans to the time you get a permit. And so in Singapore, if they need a new warehouse, the problem is land is so expensive and you got to build up and all that kind of, but basically the physical part of it doesn't take that long. And so it occurs to me, Jaime and Kevin, and building a warehouse doesn't take that long physically. It's not like building an office building. It's not like building an apartment building. You can do it in a couple of months. And so, our whole, do you see an opportunity here to at least get permitting changed to say, look, we're kind of behind these other countries, particularly this one, 9,000 miles away from us, because that seems to me, I just hear over and over again, it's just the lack of capacity to store stuff has become a real bottleneck for us.
And we could easily triple that capacity too, and that would meet the demand, because the ways in which cargo is funneled and stored and distributed when it's for online retail as opposed to brick and mortar is different as well. So, I was trying to spitball and find, what's the silver bullet here? What's going to solve all of our issues? And it's like, if I dropped off 100,000 roadable chassis tomorrow, is that going to solve the problems that we have? No, it's not. If I grabbed, 50,000 drivers and had them show up, would that solve? No, that won't. If I added 2 billion more square feet of warehouse infrastructure here in California, would that solve? And they're like, no, you have to triple it. I mean, there really is just that's just the enormity of this surge in cargo that we're seeing. And certainly this is going to be the new normal, this level of volume. It's just a few years early given COVID. And so like what we're saying, is this going to be a blip where we're going to, muscle through this next 12 months, and then we'll ease a little bit on our capacity and throughput within the supply chain. And then maybe people will hold off on those massive investments. Or certainly coming out of COVID, industrial real estate has been, the sexiest and sort of highest barrier to entry for a lot of people within, real estate investment sector. And so perhaps we will see some more investment on that end too. But again, it doesn't take 12 days. It'll probably be 5 years before you see your warehouse open if you start it today. So you want to be pretty damn sure that the volumes will persist to meet that demand, especially if you're going to a far-flung area that's not right here within the normal course of our Southern California Inland Empire.
When you put the words sexy and industrial building together, I think of, there was a wonderful Tom Wolfe novel called A Man in Full from about 25, 30 years ago. And the whole point was that this Atlanta developer sells his cash flowing industrial building to try to save his failing office building because he considers the office building a way to make himself more sexually attractive than the industrial building. So, Wolf may have gotten it wrong when he characterized it that way 25, 30 years ago. There are 3 questions here, and I'd like the whole panel to jump in on this, involving cybersecurity and port security, both within the port and offshore. Do we need to be spending more resources on this? Is this a vulnerability? What should we do about it? And I think all 3 of you are very well qualified to answer this question. And I'm trying to get everybody's question in before the end. So I'm squashing 3 questions together on this one. So Bruce, Bob, and Brian, thank you for asking the general question about security. Just thoughts on this as an issue going forward. And I'll let any one of you jump in on this one.
Well, I think we should let Kenneth start as a cybersecurity expert. Digital expert.
I'm not, but I will give it a try. I think for Singapore, I think cybersecurity is an important aspect as we push and catalyze digitalization. Cybersecurity is the other side of the same coin, because we don't want all our digitalization effort to go to waste if the cybersecurity is weak. So on that front, we actually do work with the port terminal operators, PSA, Jurong Port, and critical infrastructure to actually have a connected system to monitor the threats, the cybersecurity threats, the physical, and that is ongoing. We call it the SOC, which is the Operations Center. And then at the same time, I think we also put in investment R&D dollars to get the university to look at how the shipboard systems and the port system interact in terms of cyber readiness, so that you don't get this mismatch of cybersecurity maturity level between the ships and the port, because they need to work hand in hand. Then, of course, you have the national security agencies, whether it's the police or the navies. They themselves also invest a lot in cybersecurity and security system, into autonomous patrol boats and all those stuff, so that it complement us together to make sure that the Singapore port waters is always safe, because we have a responsibility, and Singapore has the role of a search and rescue role on the Straits of Malacca. So we need to be able to be ready to respond when there is a distress call. So I think all in all, I think it is always working together with industries and agencies to put in place the cybersecurity, as they say, that the strength of the chain is at the weakest link, right? So we always need to make sure that we help each other out and to beef up the capabilities in this space.
I agree. We've committed and invested enormous amounts in cybersecurity. We have our own CSOC, Cybersecurity Operations Center, and a resiliency program. And, you know, like I said, a huge investment in that area. We know how bad it is when a terminal goes down or a shipping line gets compromised, or even when Target gets hacked and all of our credit card information is out there. And so we take that incredibly seriously. And that's been a huge prong of our investment in infrastructure moving forward.
But beyond the cybersecurity, what about the physical security issues? How much do you, now I don't even know how screening happens, is when the boxes come out, are they scanned somehow, or are they just allowed to come into the country or go out of the country? And then the ships themselves sitting, awaiting arrival in port, are they vulnerable, or are they pretty secure? And, or are you not permitted to talk to us about these issues because in doing so you would compromise security?
Tell people all of the secrets. No, we certainly work with Homeland Security and the Coast Guard. We have a bunch of scanners and underwater driving machines that they can, you know, examine all of the hull of the ships that come in. They look for radioactive or chemical materials or explosives, etc., along with people or goods that may be trying to be smuggled in.
And what about, I mean, what about the protection of the ships that are sitting, awaiting the ability to come into port? I mean, are they vulnerable, or are they not so much?
I hope not. I think that's all within the purview of the Coast Guard, which LA Port Police works with by sea and air.
So, well, we have 2 minutes to the top of the hour, and I'm a big believer in finishing on time. So I want to ask all three of you one last question for a quick answer. I actually think we learned a lot from the global financial crisis that's enabled us to do better through this pandemic than we otherwise might have. What is the lesson that we should have learned from the supply chain issue that we have been facing for the last 6 or 7 months, so that it doesn't happen the next time we face a more general crisis?
Go on vacation and stop shopping. It's good for the economy. It's good for retail businesses and all that stuff. But I mean, but really people are sitting home just incessantly buying stuff that they don't need.
For us, Singapore as a transshipment hub, our role is really, as I mentioned, try to do catch-up port, provide the services and all that. What we really think that this congestion issue will teach us is really this collaboration between port to port, because the arrival time, the reliability of the schedules can actually be improved if the different ports communicate to each other in terms of the vessels leaving, the vessels arriving, which vessels are coming and all that, so that they can better plan in terms of the ship arrival. Then, of course, in terms of the containers and all that, it is the role of some transshipment hub ports in the different parts of the world to try to manage the containers, and of course the empty containers flowing back to Asia as well. So digital and data sharing will be very important aspects as we move forward. Just like we talked about cybersecurity, just want to mention also that between the ports, I think in LA ports and the different parts of the world, the port authority actually share information about cybersecurity, so that there is enough time for response if one part of the chain has been hacked, and then the other ports authority can actually take action. So likewise, I think to solve such a supply chain issue, it is about data sharing across the different ports to manage the supply chain as well and create this visibility. Thanks.
So Kevin, last word in 30 seconds.
It's hard for people to do in a quarterly results world, but think ahead. Actually, go think a few months ahead. As a consumer, as a business, as a shipping company, as everybody, just think a few months ahead, and it'll make things a lot more stable and a lot less just in time.
So Jaime Lee, Kenneth Lim, Kevin Klowden, thank you so much for such an enlightening hour, and I'll turn it back over to Anjali to take us out.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, Kenneth, Kevin, Jaime, for sharing with us your expertise on this timely topic. I would like to thank again U.S. Asia Real Estate Initiative founding sponsor, OUE, for their generous support. There are also several partners I would like to acknowledge for their promotional support: AmCham Shanghai, Asia Society Hong Kong, Milken Institute, RAND Corporation, USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, USC Marshall School of Business iBear, and UCLA Zimmern Center for Real Estate. If you enjoyed this program, please consider showing your support by making a donation or by becoming a member. To donate, please visit asiasociety.org/donatela. To join, please visit asiasociety.org/memberla. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, please mark your calendars for our next program, a screening and Q&A, I Was a Simple Man, on December 3rd at Laemmle Royal Theatre. We hope to see you then, and until then, those in the US, have a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you. Goodbye.